All right, so this video is going to examine the claim that Ezra chapter 7, as frequently said in all kinds of Adventist literature, begins the edict, or is the edict, by a Persian king to rebuild Jerusalem. And Adventists take what happens in Ezra 7:7, usually 7:7, 8, relate that to Daniel 9:25, which talks about the rebuilding of Jerusalem, and Waza Bing, we have 457 BC, starting the whole point of Adventist chronology. If you haven't watched the video preceding this one, which is on Daniel 9:25, you should watch that, because you're going to need to understand that. You are going to see in this video, where both the video prior to this on Daniel 9:25 and this video here completely brings down, destroys the first chronological point of the Adventist mathematical biblical schema that they like to portray. And as you're going to see here, again, you saw it in the previous video, this famous book here, which is just full of biblical error, by Ellen White, which has that very same chart, which you're going to see here in a minute. Now, this video here, by the way, absolutely proved Adventists misunderstand Daniel 9:25, because Adventists do what Adventists do, is they read a Bible verse, they ignore the Bible passage. We read the Bible passage in the previous video for Daniel, and by reading and understanding the Bible passage, it absolutely refutes their use of Daniel 9:25 and shows it to be false. So this video is not going to focus on the 457 BC date as if the date is an issue. The date's not an issue. The event is an issue. This video is going to show the three Persian kings in Ezra 1 through 7 have nothing to do with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. They have everything to do with the rebuilding of the temple, nothing to do with the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Sorry, this is going to be a long video. I want to say, on one hand, sorry, not sorry, because we are going to have to study the Word of God. Not sorry. We're going to have to briefly look, starting in Ezra 1, to make the point and to show the point and to show the consistency. The Persian kings are consistent. Rebuild the house of God. And we're going to have to show that. It's going to be a quick pace review through Ezra 1 through 7. Spend a little more time in Ezra 7. But first we're going to start with the claims in Adventist literature. We have to prove that Adventists, believe and say what Adventists believe and say. So we're going to start with the Great Controversy, the false book, written by Ellen White. Look with me here. Same book used also in the Daniel video, same one I just held in my hand. It's my good old faithful 1888 version. Here is that chart by Ellen White. It's between two, the chart itself is not on a numbered page in the Great Controversy, but it's between those two pages. And you can see where the whole schema of Adventism starts, 457 BC. And what does Ellen White cite? Daniel 9:25 and Ezra 7:7. Now, like I said, Daniel 9:25 is already shown to be false and inaccurate understanding in the previous video. Now, what Adventists do is they link Daniel 9:25 and Ezra 7:7 as if, everybody knows that they're linked together. It is an artificial link that you just look here and you can see this. Completely artificial. They like to establish this link. They believe it's going to support their 457 BC date. Let's continue and look and see what Adventists further say about 457 BC. Here, Signs of the Times, December 1974, the one on the left. Look at the yellow tab. The beginning point of this prophecy is given in Daniel 9:25. It would start when a decree went forth to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. Okay, that's what Daniel 9:25 says. Then it says 80 years later, Ezra quoted the very decree Daniel predicted. Well, no, he didn't, actually. That's Adventists saying that. And I'll read the pink text underneath it. The Persian Emperor Artaxerxes not only allowed the Israelites to return to Jerusalem, but supplied materials to help them rebuild the city. I am going to stress this point here again. Read the pink text again. The Emperor Artaxerxes did what? Supplied materials to help rebuild the city. In Ezra 7, it says 11 through 26. Let's just cut on some slack here, and let's just say the entire chapter of Ezra 7. Remember this, I'm going to quote this many times. Right hand side, October 1959, Review and Herald. The beginning with the going forth of the command to restore and rebuild Jerusalem mentioned in Daniel 9:25, which according to the scriptures was the 7th year of Artaxerxes, or 457 BC. No, it's not according to the scriptures, linking the two together and then putting the date on it. It's what Adventists say. The scriptures don't say that, but we are going to prove that. Let's look here at One Adventist magazine. By the way, I'm going to go through a couple more slides, and then we're going to cut out of the library here, and I'm going to go back onto the computer screen. So let's look here. This Adventist Review, September 1st, 1994. Page 13 says, and the decree of Artaxerxes in 457 BC, there it is again, authorizing the full restoration of Jerusalem. There it is, full restoration of Jerusalem. Ezra 7:12 through 26. The next sentence says this decree was renewed in 444 BC when Nehemiah was returning to Jerusalem in Nehemiah 1. Now I read that and I went, really? Nehemiah chapter 1 is a what's it say here? It's a renewal of the decree. Well, let's look here. Here's the entire Nehemiah chapter 1, which is 11 verses. And you know what? Nowhere in Nehemiah chapter 1 is there any mention of Nehemiah or a decree being renewed. Is there not a Berean in the Seventh-day Adventist church who had just... Could not anybody have just opened up Nehemiah chapter 1 and read it and went, hey, author of the article, that's not in there. And it's not. You look, you read it. I did. It's not there. There is not a Berean in this church. The only Bereans are the former Adventists who leave. They're the ones that really understand Scripture. Let's continue to read here. Then they go on to say there's really 5 points here that they make. And they're all fairly accurate in terms of what happens in Ezra 7. Point 1, you can see in the third line down, permission of the exiles to return. Point 2, funds were assigned to support the temple, not construct a city. Point 3, the temple personnel were tax exempt. True. Point 4, Ezra was to investigate the conditions of the people of Judah in terms of their law, and that's true. Then you can see there's a point 5, and he was to establish a legal system based on the Torah. Yeah, that's all true. But you didn't see in there the building of a city of Jerusalem, because you know why? It's not there. Let's continue reading. And then they go on in the next paragraph. They just reiterate their point. 457 BC is the decree to restore and build Jerusalem. So I'm going to finish here on this slide, and then we're going to go to the computer. So what do we know from Adventist literature so far? Just a few examples we've shown. Could have showed you these for 5 hours if I wanted, but it's all over Adventist literature. Adventists believe Ezra 7, as it says here in this horrible book full of false teaching, that Ezra 7 contains the decree to rebuild Jerusalem from the Persian Emperor Artaxerxes. But this video is going to examine now Ezra chapters 1 through 7. It's going to examine all the decrees by the Persian kings, starting with Cyrus, the opposition that comes after Cyrus from and the kings of Xerxes and Artaxerxes. Then Haggai the prophet is going to enter the scene, and then the Persian satrap. And that's a Persian governor. You see the word satrap, think a politically appointed governor, a politically appointed person by the king. This Persian governor is going to oppose the Jewish building activity, going to appeal to Darius. Darius is going to be asked by the Jews to search the records of the original authorization to build, and he's going to then issue a decree, and we'll see that in a minute. Ezra is going to come to King Artaxerxes in 457 BC, seeking permission to do something, which we will look at in a minute. Artaxerxes is going to issue a decree in Ezra 7, but first we're going to start here in Ezra 1 on screen. All right, we are going to start here with the Decree 1 from King Cyrus of Persia. You can see here, I'm going to show some artifacts on some slides. These are real people. And we have found artifacts. Here's the Cyrus cylinder from the 6th century BC. Now, in here, we're going to see that Ezra 1:1, in the first year of Cyrus, king of Persia, that what? God stirred the spirit of Cyrus to make a decree in 538. Why did he do that? Because Isaiah, and you can look these up. I'm not going to take the time to show them on screen. Isaiah 45, 1 through 13. God's going to use Cyrus to build his city, Ezra 1:1. And Isaiah 44:28
Cyrus is going to build the temple and lay the foundation. So I know I said Isaiah 45, 1 through 13, God, where it says going to build his city, but the context of every verse about Cyrus, both here in Ezra and in Isaiah, is the temple of God. Jeremiah prophesied the nation of Israel would be captive for 70 years. The 70 years had elapsed, or nearly elapsed, as you can go back and listen to the video I did on Daniel 9:25. The fulfillment of Jeremiah 25 was about to complete as promised. There's Jeremiah 25. The word of the Lord came to Jeremiah concerning the people of Judah in the 4th year, it says. And then what it says, you've neither listened nor inclined your ears to hear anything, although the Lord persistently sent you his servants or prophets. And he says, behold, I'm going to send, really you can see, Nebuchadnezzar. He is going to come. He is going to utterly destroy everything, and people are going to look at you, and it's a horror, a hissing sound. It's an everlasting desolation. This whole land is going to become ruin and waste, and you will serve Babylon for 70 years. So see in Ezra 1:2, read verse 2. This decree by Cyrus is to do what? Build him a house in Jerusalem. That is the context. Not building the city of Jerusalem, build a house in Jerusalem. This decree authorizes the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem. Jeremiah 25 is fulfilled. Daniel's prayer in 9:3 is fulfilled. Cyrus authorizes the house of God, the temple, to be rebuilt, as he says here in verse 3, not the city. Cyrus authorized the exiles to contribute to the construction using their gold and silver for the house of God. Again, I'm going to say this a gazillion times, not the rebuilding of the city of Jerusalem. Verse 7, you can see Cyrus gives back the temple vessels, the temple service, worship, accoutrements that they had. And they're all labeled here and numbered, etc. 5,400 vessels are being returned, all those that were taken by Nebuchadnezzar for temple worship. King Cyrus decreed and authorized a rebuilding of the house of God, not Jerusalem. So God, through Cyrus, decreed the rebuilding of the temple and not the city of Jerusalem. We continue to Ezra 2, and we list, here is everybody that is returning. All the exiles, and the amount of them are returning. Continue on to Ezra 3 now. And you can see they built, what they did first. So they got the authorization from Cyrus to build. And what do they build first? They build an altar. And they set it up in their place. And because the peoples, they want to do burnt offerings to the Lord, they immediately begin sacrificing. That's what they build first. Now in Ezra 3:8, you can see temple destruction decreed by Cyrus follows altar construction. So they're rebuilding the temple. Appointment of the Levites, 21 years old and upward, to supervise the work of the house of the Lord. And we got supervising the workmen for the house of God, and the builders laid the foundation for the house of God, and they wept with joy when they saw foundation has been laid. So now we got progress. The temple foundation has been laid. But we run into opposition. First we run into opposition by Xerxes, then Artaxerxes the first. Now here we are at the first opposition, Ezra 4:6, Ahasuerus. That's King Xerxes. So there was a letter sent to him. We don't have the answer to that letter. But we have another account of another letter sent. And in the days of Artaxerxes, a commander wrote a letter against the Jews to get them to stop the work. And the letter says what? This is a copy of the letter that they sent. And what does the politician in the region say? They're rebuilding, you look at verse 12, they're rebuilding the wicked and rebellious city. He's lying on them because that wasn't their charge. They were allowed to rebuild the temple. Nowhere do we find rebuilding of a city until we get here, when actually they're being lied about. Look at verse 21. Therefore, the king got the letter, and he's like, whoa, they're doing what? Verse 21, make a decree. Tell these men to quit. Stop it now. So the political governors in the area get the decree from King Artaxerxes, take it to the Jews, and say, see, stop work. And verse 24, it says what? It ceased until the 2nd year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. All work is on hold. Stop building the temple. But enter the prophet Haggai. Ezra 5:1, prophets Haggai and Zechariah, son of Iddo, prophesied to the Jews who were in Judah and Jerusalem in the name of God their Israel over them. And what did they prophesy? Here's what they prophesied. In the 7th month of the 21st day of the month, the word of the Lord came by the hand to Haggai the prophet. Haggai says, who is left among you who saw this house in its former glory? Because some of them that were captives are now old. So you remember what the house of God looked like, don't you? How do you see it now? It's nothing in your eyes, right? Because everything was destroyed as promised. Again, this is all about the temple. And then Haggai goes on to say, work, for I am with you, declares the Lord of hosts. Then he goes on to say basically this, and you can read these verses. God, through Haggai's prophesying that the funds needed to finish the temple, it's going to come. This is a prophecy recording the rebuilding of the temple, not the city. And God also says the glory of his house, verse 9, is going to be greater than the former. So what do? They got a letter from the king saying, stop, quit. And they quit. Now we got Haggai the prophet saying, get back to work. So what do? They ignore the stop work order from the Persian governor or politician in the area. And you can see here, and they began to rebuild the house of God that was in Jerusalem. Because, hey, the prophets told us we could do that. But the governor, Tatiani, the governor in the province, says, whoa, what are you doing? Look at verse 3. He says, hey, who gave you permission to start this up again? And give me the names of everybody who's doing this building. And you can see in verse 5, but the eye of their God was on the elders of the Jews, and they did not stop until it got to Darius's ears, and he found out it was going on. So this governor that I mentioned, Tatiani, and by the way, look in the upper left-hand corner. These artifacts we find are just phenomenal. Here's a document by this very same guy who's mentioned in the Bible. It's a promissory note in the 20th year of King Darius. It's just so important. I want you to realize we're talking about real people who left us real documents. And there's one of them. Anyway, let's look at verse 7 and 8. So this letter to Darius accurately cites, they didn't lie this time, that they're building the house of God. You can see it in verse 8, because they're building the house of God. So this governor in this province is sending a letter to the king saying, look what they're doing. We told them to stop. They're starting again. But then the Jews say, but we're going to reply to this too now. And this is how the Jews replied in verse 11. And they say, we are servants of the God of heaven and earth. We are rebuilding the house of God that was built many years ago for the great king of Israel. We're going to build it and finish it because Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon is the one that came and destroyed it. And you can see in verse 16 about the foundations. Remember, we already saw that. They were done. So we got really two letters now going to the king. But the Jews say something else. Look with me here. They say in verse 16, they say to King Darius, we got a decree from Cyrus back in the day to do this. Please go search your archives, find that letter of authorization, and see that that's why we're doing what we do. Let's continue. And so we progress now from Ezra 5 to Ezra 6. But before we get there, here's another artifact. Here is King Darius. I want you to notice something here. Look at this gentleman here approaching King Darius. Look at his hand. We are so unaccustomed now in the West to analyze art that look at his hand. It is over his mouth. When I was doing some research on this, I found out nobody was allowed to approach King Darius without covering their mouth. And even when you talked, you had to cover your mouth. Interesting artifact. Anyway, let's start here with Ezra 6:1. So Darius makes this decree to go search the archives. Let's see if what these members of the nation of Israel are saying is true. Was there a letter from Cyrus that authorized this to take place? And guess what? A scroll was found. Cyrus the king had indeed issued a decree. So what does Darius do? He sends a letter back to Tatiani, the governor, and you can see it in verse 6, and he basically says, keep away. Leave these people alone. And by the way, let their work on this house of God, that's the temple again, not the city, in verse 6, commence and continue. And they're going to rebuild, look at Ezra 6:8, their house of God. He found the letter from Cyrus and says, indeed, that's what they were authorized to do. That's what they are doing. Leave them alone. Let them do it. And by the way, in verse 9, I'm going to help them out because they're building the house of God for worship. So I'm going to give them what they need for worship. Look in 6:9. Whatever is needed, bulls, rams, sheep, burnt offerings to the God in heaven, wheat, salt, wine, oil, as the priests in Jerusalem require. Give it to them. Here's a Persian king offering the Jews, and he knows what they need when they worship in their temple. And he says, give it to them. Give them all those things so they can make their sacrifice. So here we are now. Remember, we said we're going to do Ezra 1 through 7. We're already in Ezra 6. Do we have a Persian king yet talking about the restoration, building of Jerusalem? Pretty silent. Continue. We get the temple is now done in Ezra 6. The temple is finished, dedicated. They celebrate the Passover. Nowhere in the, I'm going to say this again, nowhere in the first 7 chapters of Ezra is there a Persian king who authorizes the rebuilding of Jerusalem. Nowhere. It's not there. We have now seen decrees from Cyrus, Darius, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, all talking about the temple of God. But we are going to go now to Decree 3, which Adventism seems to like, decree of King Artaxerxes I. We are going to continue our hunt for a Persian king who decreed to rebuild Jerusalem in Ezra. Here we are, 457 BC. We're going to look at the entire chapter of Ezra 7, starting with verse 1. You can look at the first 6 verses. This is not an exhaustive list of the lineage, but it's used to show that Ezra is a God-ordained member of the priesthood who is skilled in the law of Moses or the Pentateuch, and that he has the right to officially teach the law of God, that he has the law, that he has the hand of God on him. Look at verse 10 here. Verse 6. For the hand of the Lord was on him. Verse 10 is, Ezra had a heart to study the law of God. Somewhere search for me here and find where Ezra has a heart to be a building project manager, managing construction workers. Ezra is a priest working in the temple. Interesting. And then, here it is, went up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes the king. And some of the people, and some of the priests and Levites, singers and gatekeepers, and temple servants. Hey, it's all about the temple. Where does Ezra, this is it now, because hey, we looked at Seventh-day Adventist literature, and it says Ezra 7:7 or Ezra 7:7 to 7:8, depending on what literature you look at, says that's the decree of Artaxerxes to rebuild Jerusalem. Someone pointed out to me here. Where is it? This is like the mic drop moment. It's just not here. This whole Adventism, biblical, mathematical, silly schema just collapsed in front of your face right here. It's not here. But we're going to continue finishing Ezra chapter 7. Look at verse 6. God granted the desires of Ezra to teach the law of God. That's what he wanted to do. He wants to teach, look at these key words in verse 10, statutes and rules. These come directly from Deuteronomy, which you're going to see here in a minute. Verse 10, that's what Ezra wants to do. He wants to teach statutes and rules. This is exactly what Moses did. Moses look at everything here, statutes and rules. I taught you statutes and rules. Thou hast statutes and rules, etc., etc., etc. Ezra wants to do exactly what Moses did in Deuteronomy chapter 4. Let's continue with Ezra. Remember, Ezra wants to teach statutes and rules to the nation of Israel, and the hand of God was on him. Ezra 7:6. Now, King Artaxerxes now finally issues his decree in 13, and it says, I make a decree that any one of the people of Israel, or their priests, or their Levites in my kingdom, who freely offers to go to Jerusalem, can go with you. He's just allowing people to go back to Jerusalem, not rebuild the city of Jerusalem. We still haven't seen that yet. And all he is doing is merely continuing the policy of Cyrus in Ezra 1. Send them back to Jerusalem. You can look at the language here between Ezra 7 and Ezra 1, and it's the same intent and purpose. Continuing, Ezra 7:14. This is the first statement of Ezra's mission in the decree by the king. He is now allowed to ascertain the extent of Jewish law observance, but you can see it's limited to Judah and Jerusalem. This was the Persian king's opportunity to keep peace and consolidate this community. You have to understand, this is a political environment, and there's wars going on at this point in time. And when there are wars going on, revolts happen. And Persian kings, or any king, not even Persian, any king who has a large kingdom is concerned about internal revolts. And there's nothing easier to do than, well, consolidate a bunch of people who may become revolters and put them in one single place. They're easier to keep track of. You can see here the last part of this verse when the king is talking, and he's talking about the law, and he says, which is in your hand. That does not mean Ezra was walking around with the Pentateuch in his hand. It actually means that which should be already known in that region. Now I want you to look at the following verses is what Cyrus decreed by 1:4, Ezra 1:4. Also financial resources. See, it's the same. Ezra 1, Ezra 7, we got financial resources being given. And it's all for temple worship. Notice in verse 15 where the financial resources are to go. The house of God. That is in Jerusalem. There's still no rebuilding of a city. So I want you to recall what we read earlier in Adventist literature. Remember what I said? I want you to remember this about building materials. That said the decree is going to, the Ezra 7 decree is going to give building materials. Where are those building materials? You realize we're over halfway through chapter 7 right now. We haven't seen any building materials. Unless you want to call gold and silver and bowls and lambs and, building materials for walls. Okay. Now, it was a common ancient Near Eastern kingly practice to honor the worship practices of others. That's what they did. This was meant to keep the peace, and they believed in all kinds of gods. And they said, well, if the Israeli God is happy, then maybe he won't punish us. So they went to great means not only to appease the God of the Jews, but other gods, and I'll mention one here in a few minutes. So very common ancient Near Eastern practice. Marching down our Ezra Chapter 7 list. Look at verse 17. The king decrees how to spend the funds that are going to be provided. This is all temple worship. I'm going to show you Numbers 15, 1 through 16 in a minute, and you're going to see this. Now, the building materials are where again? Bulls. Look at verse 17. What's being offered? Bulls, rams, lambs, grain offerings, drink offerings. So unless the walls and the cities being constructed out of bulls, rams, and lambs and drink offerings, then we still have not found building materials. I want you now to look at this. It's just a continuation. Ezra 7, again, I've already said this about 3 times. It's just a continuation of what King Cyrus did in terms of giving what is needed for temple worship. We still don't have a decree to rebuild the city. We're still hunting for that, and we are almost done with Ezra chapter 7. Verse 21 is a decree of the treasuries that's explained in verse 22. The king sets a budget for the house of God. In verse 23, that's what we're talking about, the house of God. This budget is absolutely astounding. When I did some research on this, look at verse 22. When he talks about silver, that's 3 3/4 tons of silver, 650 bushels of wheat, 607 gallons of wine and oil. It's estimated by some that was about 2 years of supplies to operate the temple. By the way, the silver was used to procure animals for temple service. It wasn't used to go procure lumber to build a wall. Silver was used to procure animals for temple service. So again, is flour, wine, and oil and animals, is that what they used to build the walls out of? Because we still haven't seen the building materials. Remember that the Adventist magazine said we saw in Ezra 7. They're not here. Now we're going to look at Numbers 15, 1 through 16. See, the Persian king shows a remarkable understanding of Jewish temple practices by including wine as a drink offering that you can see here in Exodus 29:40, and you can just look here and see what's being offered. Flour, oil mixed with oil, a lamb, a grain offerings, again more flour, oil, wine, burnt offerings, rams, goats. It's everything the king said, and it's all for temple service. Where are the building materials? And the same thing in Ezra 6. The same thing was these Persian kings have been consistent in what they have given the nation of Israel for their temple worship. Continuing with Ezra 7. We see the same ancient Near Eastern practice of appeasing the gods of various people groups that they're governing for their own safety. Just look at the end of verse 23. And, well, actually, let's just read verse 23. It says, whatever is decreed by the God of heaven, let it be done in full for the house of the God of heaven. This is Yahweh. This is the God of Israel. And they said, because, here's what the Persian king said, because if we don't, he may be against this realm and my sons. So that's a very common ancient Near Eastern practice, to appease the gods. So granting tax relief also was a very common ancient Near Eastern practice, because it was, hopefully, if I give you enough positive goodies, you won't revolt against me. And I also, in my research, found out that Darius also exempted the worshippers of Apollo from taxes, and he did that to ensure the peace. So this was not a unique action. This was a calculated political action. This was a most troubling time in Persia. Persia, who actually at this time was governing Egypt. Egypt was in a revolt. The governor they appointed over Egypt was killed. The Persian army was trying to fight the Greeks. You may have heard of the Battle of Marathon. That didn't go so well. So when you have trouble in Egypt, you're trying to take over Greece, it didn't work so well. And if you're ruling other people in your kingdom, they may be looking around going, this might be a time to revolt. These guys got their army in Greece. They got problems in Egypt. I think I'm going to do that. So consolidating the Jews in Jerusalem and offering them some favors, hey, that was just the Persian king's means to hopefully forego another revolt in his kingdom. Okay, again, where's the directive to rebuild Jerusalem? We're almost done here. Now, this decree now switches back. See, above it, it was to the governor of the region saying, you give the nation of Israel these things for their temple worship. Now the decree here in 725 switches and goes directly to Ezra. And you, Ezra is allowed to appoint judges for the law of God. I'm still looking for builders and building materials. All right, don't see them. This is another significant decree by the king of Artaxerxes. He just allowed Ezra judges beyond Judah and Jerusalem, and actually into all of Transjordan. This follows the command of Deuteronomy, which is when you're setting up the Jewish system, you appoint judges to handle legal disputes. Deuteronomy 1, Deuteronomy chapter 16, Deuteronomy chapter 18. It's all there. 726. Artaxerxes, this is really interesting now, demands the enforcement of Jewish and Persian law. Let that soak in for a minute. Look at what he says. Whoever will not obey the law of your God and the law of the king. So Artaxerxes now is demanding the following of Jewish law and Persian law at the same time. Remember, Ezra's mission was to teach the law, Ezra 7:10. Now the king imposes sanctions on lawbreakers. And you can see here, one of the sanctions, the very last word in Ezra 7:26 is imprisonment. That's not an Israeli Jewish practice. That was a Persian practice, by the way. Construction of the city of Jerusalem is where? We've been going through this one verse at a time. Remember, Ezra's heart was to study the law of the Lord and to teach statutes and rules, not be a builder. Here are the last two verses of Ezra 7. This is a psalm of praise by Ezra, thanking God for his provisions and favor. Ezra saw his mission and desire to teach God's law and rebuild the temple totally by the graces of God. Ezra saw the temple rebuilding of the house of God and reinstituted temple services. This completes the mission of Ezra. So what do we have here? There is no building activity in Ezra 7 at all. They're not building anything. They're worshiping in a temple. There is no building activity in Ezra 7. All building activity was completed when? In Ezra 6. 457 BC is not the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. 457 BC is a decree to let Ezra teach God's law. It's not until October of 445 BC that Nehemiah begins construction. That's Nehemiah 2:5. Look at the screen down below when Nehemiah says what? Send me to Judah, to the city of my fathers, Jerusalem, that I may rebuild it. 457 BC minus 445 BC. That's a 12-year difference. Guess what? Adventists, your chronology is false. The Adventist understanding of 457 BC has just been proven false by the Word of God. Here is 111 years of consistent teaching in Adventist literature in a variety of Review and Herald magazines that Ezra 7 is the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. No, it's not. We didn't see a single decree to rebuild Jerusalem in Ezra 7. We just went through every verse. The scriptures do tell us when Jerusalem, not the temple, but Jerusalem will be rebuilt. 445 BC, Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 1, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. And you've already seen this already. Nehemiah 2:5, when Nehemiah says, send me to Judah, unto the city of my fathers, Jerusalem, that I may rebuild it. Remember what Adventist chronology does. They start with Daniel 9:25, that when the order to rebuild Jerusalem comes, and then you can see at the end of it shall be built again with squares and moat. This is the 490-year prophecy. Daniel, let me just say this. The word for moat here is karutz. and its variant is only used in Daniel 9:25. This word for moats is only found here. And so I want you to think this is not a moat like you would see around an English castle with water. Jerusalem is a desert. Jerusalem, the city, is on a hill. And an English-style moat, impractical, if not impossible. So this word, moat, sometimes it's transferred as trench. It has been a source of translation difficulty for hundreds of years until a copper scroll was found with the Dead Sea Scrolls in the 1940s where the same exact word was used. And you know how it was used? It was used in terms, the context was to make an aqueduct. The transportation of water. Ah, that makes sense. Jerusalem's going to be built with squares and have an aqueduct, have a system to give water to the people. Here is that copper scroll. I did some research on that. You see at the bottom, these little cupped pieces down there. The actual scroll itself, they cut it into pieces, and so they could read it. And that's what you see above you, and that's probably the actual scroll that they cut. So the beginning point of this Adventist chronology, 457 BC, is simply wrong. There is no decree in Ezra 7 to rebuild the city of Jerusalem. It's actually, city of Jerusalem is actually, a decree is 445 BC. So sorry, because it's the first point of the Adventist chronology, this whole thing just collapses like a house of cards. The Word of God. Just read Ezra Chapter 7. Is there not a Berean in the Adventist church? Just read Ezra Chapter 7 and find rebuild Jerusalem. And you won't. That's why 457 BC is now falling like a house of cards.